In my talk, I'm going to take you back millions of years to understand what ancient climates were like, particularly during what we call the Cretaceous period, about 100 million years ago, when dinosaurs lived on Earth and we had a much warmer climate due to natural carbon dioxide in the environment. And there were even forests living near the South Pole. And then I will take you on through climate change till present day and explain what's happening to Antarctica in the climate that we're warming so rapidly today and the implications for the whole planet.
Yeah, within my talk I will address the question of how climate and biodiversity are intertwined, and not forget about how the human society, the human system is influencing these relationships. And I will cover the basic mechanisms that we currently address in terms of understanding what is shaping biodiversity across the globe, and how these biodiversity patterns are changing under recent climate change. And finally going into the question of what kind of solutions do we have available in order to protect biodiversity, stabilize the climate, and move us into a better world. Well, certainly it has to do with the animals that I've worked on in my scientific career, and it's starting with simple animals like worms living in the intertidal. I've then moved on to work on amphibians and on fish, and Atlantic cod has been a long-standing object of our research. But I've also worked on squid, high-performance invertebrates, in order to see whether the physiological solutions animals have evolved over evolutionary time, how they can be compared, and how they help today's animals to overcome the challenges that we have available for them.
My favourite animal, well, I think you probably expect me to say something like penguins or something from the Antarctic, which I will say because I think penguins are absolutely fantastic. And the thing I find really fascinating about penguins is that they actually evolved about 50 million years ago at a time when the world was much warmer, and actually Antarctica had a temperate climate. So penguins evolved in warm climates, and I guess you could say only the more adaptable or perhaps the stupid ones stayed in Antarctica as Antarctica became icy and cold. But there are many penguins now that live in much more warmer places like South Africa and Australia even. But interestingly, in the places where I've worked in Antarctica, there are penguin bones that show that ancient penguins were 6 foot high. Now, can you imagine meeting a 6 foot high penguin in a cold, dark night? The most memorable times, I think, are always doing field work, picking up a rock, hitting it with a hammer, and then it reveals a fossil plant, generally a fossil plant. And that goes for, well, I remember even back when I was doing my PhD on the Dorset coast, working on fossil forests of the Dorset coast, Jurassic forests. I distinctly remember one lunchtime hitting a piece of rock and finding plant remains, fossil plant remains of Jurassic age. And I knew, these were quite unusual, and I knew it would change the whole structure of my PhD, which it did, to the better. But also being in Antarctica as well, being in a cold, icy environment, you know, wrapped up to the nines, hitting a rock, and then again revealing, say, a fossil leaf that shows you that Antarctica was once tropical. It's quite a paradox. Amazing moment.
Well, if I think about the most memorable moment in my career, it hasn't been so much a moment. It has been the evolution, or the personal evolution of insight, of cause and effect understanding. For example, with respect to how global climate change is affecting ocean biology and the physiology of marine animals. It has been so rewarding over time to consider the climate parameters like temperature, CO2 and oxygen in the ocean, how they come together, how they have changed, how this has shaped animal evolution over evolutionary time, considering the mass extinction events, what kind of life forms emerged from this, and the picture, this kind of understanding the world in a better way by considering the process of anthropogenic climate changes has been so rewarding, but certainly at the same time it has been so concerning in terms of the need to, from this basic understanding, the need to stop this process and go back to a stable climate. I think I would like people to understand that we have a limited window of opportunity that we are currently living in order to change our attitude towards planet Earth and to bring all the different aspects together, ranging from understanding simple facts in biology to human health. And it would also be important for the audience to understand that our species, the human species, has been depending so much on a stable climate, the climate of the Holocene, for the last 12,000 years, for us to populate the planet, to build the high population density that we are currently having, and that we are currently leaving this climate window and putting ourselves at risk as much as we are putting the natural world at risk.
The one thing I'd like people to take away is to understand how climate change is part of a whole response of the Earth system. So you can't just take one part of it, you have to understand how everything interrelates. And to remember that Antarctica is a critical part of that system. And it actually, although we don't see it, it's so remote, it actually drives many of the whole systems of the Earth, the oceans, the atmosphere and the climate, even though we don't actually see it. Remember, Antarctica's there. It's a powerful force.
Well, if people are thinking about what they need to be changing in their lives to help mitigate climate change, I would say there is not the one thing that is the most important, but we need to do many things at the same time. We need to consider how our lifestyle, our activities, our daily activities, our activities during vacations, how they contribute to emissions and reduce our emissions as much as possible. At the same time, put pressure on policymakers to change the circumstances that we live in a way that we are allowed to be able to do that, to reduce emissions by having technologies available to us that help us to develop sustainability.
People often ask me what's the sort of things they can do to become more sustainable and to help with climate change. And like Hans said, I think it's a two-part answer. First of all, personally, I think they need to look at their lifestyle and make sure that they're doing as much as they can to be as sustainable in terms of everything they do. But secondly, I think they really need to engage with policymakers. And this is the tricky question: how does the average person engage with policymakers? And the one really big way they can is through electing the right government that has this in their agenda. And they have local MPs and they have local action groups. So become active, actively campaign for better sustainability across our whole country.
So what worked for me, I must actually say, in terms of reducing the personal carbon footprint, was replacing our heating system in the house recently by a heat pump, putting solar panels on the roof and trying to use as little as possible from the public grid. At the same time, converting our car into a car that is using natural gas, but it's gas that is being produced from agriculture products, so that reduced emissions largely and has much less impact on the environment. So there are options available to us now which can be used, which make a lot of difference, but still we need a strong political move to improve the circumstances under which we live.
from a work point of view, we are making big changes to how we operate in Antarctica. So the British Antarctic Survey has a really strong project on decreasing our carbon footprint in Antarctica, or in everything we do, wherever we are in the world. But particularly in Antarctica, we have a large icebreaker that's absolutely critical to take us to Antarctica and to do science, to understand climate change. But it has a huge carbon footprint. So to decrease our carbon footprint, we are developing autonomous vehicles, we're using drones, we're using satellite data, every kind of invention and innovation that we can use to collect data in a less carbon way. The most interesting point I took from Hans's point is the huge wealth of information in all the IPCC reports. And I've read nearly all of them, most of them, but there's a lot of information in there. And I need to go back and read all the IPCC reports again, because they really provide a very clear picture of where we're going and a clear understanding of what's changing. And it's almost like the Bible of climate change for me.
The most impressive part of Jane's talk for me was to put the pictures to the past reality of the planet, in terms of that Antarctica was in the very position for the last 100 million years, and in warm climates it had forests and animals roaming the area, and how much climate change has been, in terms of the cooling climate, has been changing that environment, and how, although the continent is very isolated in terms of through the circumpolar current, it is still in such a crucial position to understand the future of our planet and the challenges to human civilization. If you just think of the coastlines and how they will be affected by potential sea level rise. I must say the company Biologists, by running the Journal of Experimental Biology, has always played a strong role in my career. My first scientific papers, quite a few of them, have appeared in the Journal of Experimental Biology, and I'm still publishing in that journal. I've been doing so for the last 30, almost 40 years, and there's no end to it. So I would say the model of how this journal is being run, also the business model that stabilizes the economic situation around the journal, is very satisfying. It's very satisfying to see the enthusiasm of the people involved, to see how the office is being run, the fairness with which decision processes are being made, and also the velocity of publishing. It is really a role model in the current world, where making money appears so important, but the company Biologists, together with its journals that it is running, is an ideal case and example of a no-profit constellation, and we need more of that.
The most amazing thing about the forests in Antarctica really is that they were growing at very high latitude, and when you get to near the pole, the Earth has 6 months of darkness and 6 months of daylight. So, but the plants are there, the fossils are there, and they show that they did manage to tolerate such an extreme climate. And I've done experiments with colleagues in greenhouses, and I think they clearly adapted. I think the winters were cool enough that they could go into dormancy, and they just waited during the dark, cool winters until the light came back, and then they would have grown like mad. The interesting question for me is actually about how they survived the summer, because during the summer there is continuous summer sunlight, sunlight. There is no diurnal cycle, which is very strange when you go to Antarctica and live in it. But how did trees operate in continuous sunlight with no diurnal cycle, like most vegetation does today? That's a question that really intrigues me.
A related question to me is actually, how did the animals that you found there in the fossil record, how did they survive these long periods of darkness? Were they still finding food? Were they going into dormancy? Or were they just seasonal migrants coming from the neighboring continents and land masses?
That's a very good question, and there have been publications about that from the dinosaur workers. So the general conclusion is probably that they migrated into lower latitudes where there was some sunlight and some food. Otherwise, if the plants were dormant, and there would be no plant food around. But there are also suggestions they might have hibernated. But can you imagine how a very large dinosaur might have hibernated in? That would be a very large burrow, and we haven't found any evidence of that. So I think the general consensus is they would have moved, probably as herds, many of them, into the lower latitudes. Mm-hmm.
Well, animals and their ecosystems, and marine ecosystems, will have to adapt to climate change as it is unfolding. And the very important issue is that there are certainly some limited adaptations for them to stay on site where they are, where they used to live, to stay in their current habitat. But we are already seeing trends that animals are on the move. And they are moving with especially with their preferred temperatures. As these temperatures are moving north or south, the animals are moving with them. Meaning, as their temperature sensitivity is different between species, that there will be a mixing between species, that there will be new ecosystems emerging in new climates, and we don't have a good vision currently how these new ecosystems will be looking like, and it needs a lot of experimental work, a lot of ecological empirical work to move forward and develop that kind of understanding. Certainly always combined with the hope that in the meanwhile humankind will be able to stabilize the climate and then stop this process, because in the end, if we don't do it, we will move into another mass extinction event, and climate change will play a big role in that event.
You mentioned how animals will move into more suitable environments due to climate change, and actually in the fossil record, that's how paleontologists, paleoclimatologists have understood how climates have changed in the past. We've seen the shift of an ecosystem move from higher to lower latitudes and vice versa, and that tells us that there was a climate change. So it's been a tool for climate interpretation. But that's been over millions of years, or thousands of years. So I wonder whether or not the very intense speed at which we're changing the climate at the moment means that that is a critical challenge to any kind of ecosystem or species moving into new environments. Is that really the real challenge for species?
It definitely is. And when I say they will be moving with the climate and with their preferred temperatures, then certainly this is a modeling projection, and the velocity of migration that is needed for being able to do that is for some species exceeding their possibilities. In the marine realm, we don't really have very good examples, but I would assume that the sessile species like sponges or the corals will have limited possibility. The only option they have to move fast is if they're very young life stages. Some of them are pelagic. If they are being drifted along with the temperatures. I think we have some examples in the terrestrial realm, some long-living tree species that will not be able to follow the moving climate, and that what this essentially means is local extinction, and possibly an extinction of the species if they don't manage to hop to another place, again by probably moving reproduction stages. I think our talks were very complementary on different timescales in terms of me focusing on the recent climate change, the human-made climate change since the last 150 years, which clearly is 100% human-made, starting with the Industrial Revolution. And I think it is very important to understand that the mechanisms that species and organisms are responding to nowadays have also been in place in past climate changes, and how the biological world has changed and evolved over time can only be learned from the geological history. So when I studied the literature about, and also we did our experiments about the impacts of warming and CO2 rise and oxygen loss on marine species and how they were being affected, the question emerged to what extent the turnover in the biological systems in Earth's history were driven by the same mechanisms. And much of the fossil record that we have available is in the ocean. Mm-hmm. And so a question from my side to a geologist would be, for example, how strong is the evidence from the fossil record and from our knowledge of past climates that CO2 emissions, like from the Siberian traps, may have been the key driver in those periods, and that the interaction between temperature, CO2 and low oxygen may be the key driver then in mass extinction events.
Absolutely, and I do think that particularly for Siberian trap larvae, so this is about 200 million years ago, there was the greatest mass extinction actually, and it is attributed to the CO2 output from the larvae and the lack of oxygen in the oceans. And I think also there are other periods. So although the end of the Cretaceous is usually and the extinction of the dinosaurs is usually attributed to a meteorite impact. In fact, I'm not sure that that was a global impact, because in Antarctica, although we do see changes in the marine realm, but whether they are actually attributed to a meteorite impact is hard to tell. But certainly at that time, in our pollen record, we see a warming phase, probably due to another volcanic phase in the Deccan trap lavas in India. Mm-hmm. And little change actually in the vegetation. So I do think this anoxic phase in the oceans is really important. And for example, if you also take the early part of the Cretaceous, about 120 million years ago, we know that there are incredible phases in the ocean, a deep ocean, where the bottom of the ocean was anoxic. There was no oxygen, and so all the organic matter in there was stored, and that has been a major oil source actually for most of our oil production. So we can study the rocks and the marine rocks that represent the ancient sea floor and correlate that with fossils to understand what the changes were and what drove extinctions particularly.
Yeah, so we can really learn a lot from the past for the present, and also develop an understanding of the time scale that has been involved in how the current time scale is comparing to that.
And what's really interesting these days, actually, I think there was a phase some years ago when the geological record wasn't really considered to be important for future predictions. But of course now we're in a world now with CO2 levels beyond our Ice Age world, at 429 I think it was today, that we have to go back 2 or 3 million years or even more to understand from the rock record what the Earth was like. So 400 parts per million, we can go back as what's called the Pliocene epoch, that's 2 to 3 million years ago. And we know from the rock record that sea levels were between 10 to 20 meters higher. There was still ice on Antarctica, but much smaller ice caps, obviously. Most of it was water was in the ocean. And the global temperature was about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it is now. So this is where we are. And in fact, the scary thing is, for a geologist, is that we're going back through the geological record quite quickly in terms of CO2 levels and the change that we might see.
Yeah, and I think the scary aspect of this is also that these changes are in a way irreversible. So if we don't stop emissions and the increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, we will have to live, and our species will have to live with the consequences for a very long time. So there is no immediate fixing, and I think especially with respect to sea level rise, does not get the attention of our policymakers sufficiently in order to see what's really coming for our countries.
Sea level rise now is increasing in rate because of the expansion of the ocean water due to warming, almost more than melting ice sheets at the moment. So that's quite scary. I mean, the ocean is warming because of the climate warming that we have made. Yes. In terms of interacting with policymakers, the British Antarctic Survey is in a quite a unique position because we work very closely with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which has links to the government offices that deal with climate change. And we can also, because Antarctica is such a special place, attract the attention of ministers and government bodies. And so we try as hard as possible to use Antarctica as a message to policymakers that things have to change. So we are quite lucky that we have a close contact with influential people, I hope, at the top of government.
Yeah, I can certainly say that the Alfred Wegener Institute is in a similar position in terms of being part of the largest research infrastructure in Germany, the Helmholtz Society, and we have close contacts with the research and education ministries. Certainly our connection to the high-level policymakers could improve. We've had ministers visiting, and we have had people traveling on Polarstern, and you know, there has been a strong, long-standing collaboration between British Antarctic Survey and Alfred Wegener Institute. I still have fond memories of my own personal visits to Rossera Base and the joint work I did down there together with colleagues from British Antarctic Survey. So I think, yes, the polar areas are important messengers of climate change and of the velocity of change, and we cannot do enough to bring this insight to the public.
Absolutely. And collaboration, international collaboration, is absolutely critical, isn't it? Climate change is a global problem. It's a really big problem, and it requires us all to work together, just to work together, to share ideas together, to share our data together, so that we can come up with a very clear understanding of where we're going in our climate story.
Ja, herzlichen Glückwunsch zum 100-jährigen Jubiläum der Company of Biologists, eine wirkliche Säule in der Wissenschaftslandschaft, und ich hoffe auf eine fruchtbare Zukunft für die weitere Entwicklung auch unserer wissenschaftlichen Disziplinen, die da eine Rolle spielen.
Happy birthday to the Company of Biologists, and I hope there's many, many, many more years of great biological research to be published in future.